Okay, it's been quite a while since we've talked of such things. I remember the last talk very, very well, and it gave me sleepless nights, and it was just after the election in America, and I applied it in the way that I did, which, with hindsight, I suppose wasn't so far from the mark, much to our concern. Anyway, we're going back to Cataclysm. And without going into everything, in the last talk, we considered Cataclysm in the land of Israel, which began, and I didn't deal with it in any great detail. We talked about the Battle of Jericho. We talked about the experience of Rahab, if you remember, and the fact that she was kept safe when the walls came tumbling down. But then we spent more time thinking about Elijah's earthquake, which I thought was really interesting and appropriate because it had something more to say about the location of Sinai, and we discussed that a little bit also in the last few talks we've done, particularly when we thought of the Exodus. And this is a map that I showed last time, which just indicates the two, perhaps the two main sites that have been suggested for the for Mount Sinai. Of course, the one on the right, Jebel al-Lawz, is the one that perhaps is the most popular one now in evangelical circles. It's in Saudi Arabia. I was very sympathetic about it at one point, and then I changed my mind. If you look on the left-hand side of this image, then you see the traditional site, which is in the Sinai Peninsula. I got a little bit more sympathy for that, but I think I have my own hypothesis, which of course is not surprising, which places Mount Sinai in a place where it no longer exists. It's actually fallen into the heart of the sea, and we discussed that a little bit because it was in the middle of an earthquake zone. And more than that, it's very exposed, or was very exposed, on the basis of what we came to understand with respect to Elijah's experience in his cave of a very powerful wind. So the powerful wind has to have an impact wherever Mount Sinai is, that it was also an earthquake, and also there was fire following. And of course we read this. This is interesting because the Lord says this more than once to Elijah. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came." That's an interesting point. And the Lord goes on to tell him that he's got to go to the desert of Damascus. And here on Google Maps, I sort of put the route that he might have taken, although presumably he had to go back via Beersheba or Beersheba, because that was the way he came, and up the north, up to the north towards Damascus. And God says to him, when you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi. He was the one that eventually got rid of Jezebel, if you remember, over Israel. And anoint Elisha to succeed you as prophet. And it's actually quite important to realise that a prophet has to think of the future. I'm thinking of this because I'm now 73 years old, so whatever I embark on now, there needs to be somebody younger to take my place in due course. But he's on the way to Damascus to do these various things, and I put in again, just for our information, the line of the Dead Sea Transform Fault that has had such an impact in the history of Israel, past, present and future, which is the heart of the talks on Cataclysm, of course. It goes north, it goes through Lebanon, and then I showed this little picture last time, which shows the continuation of the Dead Sea Fault through Lebanon, through the mountain range of Lebanon, and we'll discuss that again in some detail in future talks, not least because of the proximity to Damascus. That's an interesting thing in itself. But this introduces us to our next earthquake, which is, I'm calling it the Amos Earthquake, which is an interesting way of describing it, because it is specifically mentioned in the book of Amos, the words of Amos, one of the shepherds of Tekoa, concerning Israel 2 years before the earthquake, when Uzziah was king of Judah. And of course this is also in the time of several other prophets, not least Isaiah. We'll come on to that. Now, I want to introduce you one person in particular, which is the guy on the left on screen, which is Steve Austin. But this was a paper that was published in an academic journal, which is the International Geology Review, which is describing this earthquake, Amos's earthquake, an extraordinary Middle East seismic event of 750 BC. So we're talking of the 8th century BCE. Now, some of us might have come across Steve Austin over the years, and I do think, Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we showed the DVD about Mount St Helens at Castle Court. I think we did, and the person who put that together, as you see, hosted by geologist Dr. Steve Austin. So that's introducing Steve, but we'll come back to Steve again. He actually wrote a more popular article, I suppose you might say, in the Institute of Creation Research magazine, The Scientific and Scriptural Impact of the Amos Earthquake. Now, I'm not going to deal with that article, but I've got the details of that, and you can look it up if you would like. But I'm going back to the main academic paper, because there's much, much more information. Steve, I've introduced to you, but the second person I just wanted to mention briefly, who is Gordon Franz, because I'm not the only one in the world who thinks that Jebel El-Lawz is not the site of Mount Sinai, and Gordon Franz is one of those people, and I just mentioned that at this point in passing. But the third person is actually an academic professor in the Department of Geological Sciences at San Diego State University. That's Eric Frost. This is what it says in the abstract of this paper. Biblical and post-biblical sources indicate a single regionally extensive earthquake in the year 750 BC. The epicenter was north of the present-day Israel. You might think this is a bit obscure, but actually it'll all become clear, not necessarily today, but in a few weeks' time. Probably in Lebanon, as indicated by the southward decrease in degree of damage at sites in Israel and Jordan. It was a massive earthquake. A large area of the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah was shaken at modified Mercalli intensity 9, that's another way of measuring the intensity of an earthquake, or higher. The earthquake was at least magnitude 7.8, but likely was 8.2. And that's an enormous earthquake, Now this, I'm sorry about this figure, but in order to fit it on the slide, I turned it from being upright vertical to horizontal, but you've got the signs pointing north and the signs pointing south, and the epicenter of this earthquake was on the fault line, but the fault line as it moves off course slightly and goes through Lebanon. So that's where the epicenter of this gigantic earthquake took place. And here, as we will see, there is evidence of that earthquake. More north, Hazor, then Gaza, then En Haseva, and we will see that again on this map, which I think I did. I can't remember. No, maybe I lifted it from somewhere. Here's Tel Azor, and this is from the paper, and you see some of the damage, the earthquake damage in here, in here. Here are some of the evidence of that particular earthquake that took place in the 8th century. But I ask a question: what about Jerusalem? Did that earthquake have an impact in Jerusalem? Now, folks, you might think some of this is a bit obscure, but it has enormous significance for us, as we will see. Now, who do we turn to get information about what that earthquake might have done in Jerusalem? And does anybody remember who this person is? Correct! It's Josephus. So, as we will see, I refer a lot to Josephus in this talk, and I'm perfectly happy to do it. And this is what he says about the earthquake in the days of Uzziah. In the meantime, this is in Book 9 of Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 10, stanza 4. In the meantime, a great earthquake shook the ground, and a rent was made in the temple, and the bright rays of the sun shone through it and fell upon the king's face, insomuch that the leprosy seized upon him immediately. Now we could discuss that at length, but we just have to accept Josephus' interpretation of the fact that King Uzziah actually suffered in the end of his days with leprosy. So what does the Bible say about that? It does. In the days of Uzziah, 2 Chronicles 26 verse 16, but after Uzziah became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God, and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. And he wasn't eligible or qualified to do that. While he was raging at the priests, who obviously were trying to stop him from doing it, in their presence, before the incense altar of the Lord's temple, leprosy broke out on his forehead. Now, if we combine the two passages, then we might think that because of the rent in the temple, light was shone on his face, and the priests recognized that he had leprosy. King Uzziah had leprosy until the day he died. He lived in a separate house, leprous and excluded from the temple of the Lord. In that he was unclean. He wasn't able to go into the temple. So let's think about this earthquake, which is interesting, because actually if you read the books of Kings and Chronicles, you won't find any record of an earthquake. However, it is mentioned in at least 3 of the prophets. And I might think if I would add Nahum to that list, where he alludes to an earthquake, you could possibly say 4 of the prophets. And of course we've already seen this one, the words of Amos, one of the shepherds of Tekoa, concerning Israel 2 years before the earthquake, when Uzziah was king of Judah. First verse of the book of Amos. Amos chapter 9 verse 1. This is later on. Remember, he's writing this 2 years before the earthquake. I saw the Lord standing by the altar, and he said, strike the tops of the pillars so that the thresholds shake. So he's talking about the temple here, and he's talking about a great shaking that's taking place. And of course, I put this in. What does it remind you of? It might remind you of this. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphim, each one had 6 wings, with 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And it says this in verse 4, at the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. This is a great shaking. Of course, it's in the year that King Uzziah died. Okay, it had leprosy. And maybe one could describe it as an Amos Earthquake aftershock. I put a question mark there because you can't be certain. But anyway, there's a lot of shaking going on, folks, in the temple. This is an interesting verse for me in the book of Isaiah, who is prophesying in the reign of King Uzziah. That's the first thing that is said in the first chapter of Isaiah. See now, the Lord Almighty is about to take from Jerusalem and Judah both supply and support, all supplies of food and all supplies of water. I personally found this to be really interesting. Again, going back to the testimony of Josephus with respect to the water supply, this is what he says about the impact of the earthquake in the days of King Uzziah. And before the city, at a place called Erogi, maybe, how you pronounce it, I'm not quite sure, half the mountain broke off from the rest on the west and rolled itself 4 furlongs and stood still at the east mountain. What mountain's that, folks, do you think? That's the Mount of Olives. Till the roads as well as the king's gardens were spoiled by the obstruction. That's what he says. The question for us is, where is Erogi or Eroga? So we've got this map of Jerusalem, and here you can see Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives to the east. We've got the Hinnom Valley, which was the picture of Gehenna. Actually, at the top of this picture, which I think is interesting, you've got the Hananel Tower, which is mentioned in the prophetic scriptures in a number of places. You've got the temple area, you've got the city of David. So where is Erogi? Well, almost certainly it's here. And you see and there is definitely in more modern Hebrew, it's called En Rogel, or the Rogel Spring, okay, as shown on the map. And of course the proximity to the king's garden. So this movement, this geological movement during the period of the earthquake in the reign of King Uzziah dragged, geologically speaking, from this side towards the Mount of Olives. Before the city, at a place called Erogi, half the mountain broke off from the rest on the west and rolled itself 4 furlongs and stood still at the east mountain. Again, that is the Mount of Olives, till the roads as well as the king's gardens were spoiled by the obstruction. Now, the fact that it mentions roads being obstructed by this earthquake is quite significant, actually. I know it sounds a bit obscure, because this was a way of escape. And I know that because of a passage in 2 Samuel where it's speaking of 2 young men. Now, that Jonathan is not the Jonathan of David. This is another Jonathan. Jonathan and Ahimaaz was staying at En Rogel, all right? That is the Rogel Spring, Erogi, and a young man saw them and told Absalom. Now, this was at the time of Absalom's rebellion against his father. So the 2 young men, so the 2 of them left quickly and went to the house of a man in Bahurim, He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. Now, this is an indication that this area of Jerusalem and its proximity is extremely well watered. This is the point that I'm trying to get to here, and there's a reason for it. But they go from Enrogel to Bahurim. Where is Bahurim? Well, the fact is they are following in the footsteps of King David when he fled from Absalom. Do you remember that story? Here's a nice picture. Here's a nice picture that describes it, and this is what it says. Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword." This is 2 Samuel 15. And from wherever he was, which is presumably the palace, he continues up the Mount of Olives. This is the way David leaves the city. David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up. This is David fleeing from his son Absalom. Now, for David, the escape route was as follows. You might think, what on earth is he talking about this for? But I find it so interesting, folks. The king's palace, the royal gardens, obviously in close proximity to the king's gardens, the royal gardens, is Enrogel. He goes up the Mount of Olives, and what does it say? As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan of Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out, and he pelted David. So this is part of the route that David took, eventually over the Mount of Olives to Bahurim, which is also called Nov in scripture, and probably he went down the Wadi Kelt, which is the ancient route from Jerusalem to Jericho. And this was also the route that the man who was waylaid was cared for by the Good Samaritan, the Wadi Kelt. It's a major sort of valley, which is in plenteous times is plentifully filled with water, but here you see a photo of it virtually empty. It's an empty wadi. We're going to come back to the Wadi Kelt briefly a bit later. From there, David goes across the Jordan, and he is brought back from the other side of the Jordan when he returns to Jerusalem. However, this movement, this geological earthquake, actually blocked this way of escape. As we have already seen, by this movement, and a place called Erogi, half the mountain broke off from the rest of the west and rolled itself 4 furlongs and stood still at the east mountain till the roads as well as the king's garden were spoiled by the obstruction. So that way of escape that David used and Jonathan and Ahimaaz used was no longer available. There had to be a different way. But the fact is that this would have been the geological activity at the time of Uzziah's earthquake, or the Amos earthquake, that would have cut off the supplies of water from the city, in accord with this prophecy of Isaiah in chapter 3. Now that's the reason why many years later Hezekiah has to build his tunnel to bring water back into the city itself. The actual plentiful supply of water was cut off by this geological activity. Why is it significant, folks? Why is it significant? There will be a reversal of fortune. There will be a reversal of fortune. Now, this is something that I'll get to also in a few weeks' time, or maybe in a few months' time. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations. This is Zechariah, chapter 14. As he fights in the day of battle, on that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. Josephus speaks about this mountain, doesn't he, in his description. And the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley, with half of the mountain moving north and half moving south. And it will be a way of escape. You will flee by my mountain valley, for it will extend to Azel. Now this is interesting, I'm going to highlight it. You will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. So this is another prophetic reference to the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, the Amos earthquake. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. So all of this obscurity will become clearer as we look to see what is going to happen in the days ahead when the Lord returns to Jerusalem. Remember, David also had to flee, but he also came back. Now, this is interesting, isn't it? On that day, living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half to the eastern sea and half to the western sea in summer and in winter. That's verse 8 of chapter 14 of Zechariah. So this is a reversal of fortune. The water source that was blocked in the days of Uzziah, which persuaded Hezekiah to build his tunnel, one day there will be a reversal of fortune. This water, it says in Ezekiel chapter 47, this water flows towards the eastern region and goes down into the Arava, where it enters the sea. When it empties into the sea, the water there becomes fresh. We're going to talk about that in a few more talks from now. What am I saying here? Yeah, this is a future prediction of enormous geological activity in and around Jerusalem. And of course, we have this fantastic verse in Isaiah, which is repeated in the book of Micah. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream into it. Well, some people might say, Jeff, this is poetic. It's not going to happen like it says. I believe it will happen like it says, which involves enormous geological activity, which I think was prefigured in the days of King Uzziah, only more so. Only more so. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to talk about this in future talks. So from the Amos earthquake, I want to come now to the days of King Herod, and one earthquake that we could describe as the Herod earthquake. And I want to reintroduce my friend. I can say it. I'm so lucky as I can say it, my friend Steve Austin. And I'd been waiting for Steve to get in touch with me because I needed some pieces of information from him that I didn't really want to do this talk until I had it. And amazingly, yesterday he sent me 2 emails. So that was a confirmation to me that I could go ahead and give this talk. Here's another friend that I made a couple of years ago. He's one of Steve's associates, Ray Strom, wonderful person. 2 years ago, more or less, he took me with him on a trip to this place. This is a canyon near to the Dead Sea. It looks pretty interesting, doesn't it? It was very demanding for me to get there because at the time I don't think I had my heart fixed. So it actually was quite a demanding exercise for me to get there, but I survived. here's Steve talking about it.
Now let me show you my mud canyon. Now what I do is I've got a 30 feet deep mud gully, and that shows me in cross section the mud at the bottom of the Dead Sea. The elevation of the top of the mud gully is 410 meters below sea level, and there's 10 meters of mud, so that's 420 meters below sea level. So I have a good extensive, deep mud outcrop to study. What I do is I put wires across the gully, and then I lower ropes, and on the ropes I put knots, and I measure every meter depth in the canyon, and every layer has a depth, and that's what I study. And this is a movie, and so I'll take you through the drone movie. Here goes. So we're flying the drone in the canyon. You can see the layers. The one I'm really interested in is right there. See right there? Look at this. Imbricated pebbles of aragonite standing there. What is this? That's a beach. And that's what's underneath it. Brown and dark gray detritus down underneath it. And up above it, you see layers of aragonite and detritus, laminated aragonite and detritus. And so it makes for a whole bunch of things to study. So down about 7 meters down is the beach ridge. Okay, and fascinated by the beach ridge, and I'll tell you the story about that more fully. See if we can make this keep going. Okay, you can see, well, as we fly the drone into the canyon, around the canyon, you can see what it's like. Then we see those slope deposits. As you go up in the canyon, you see shallow water deposits of aragonite and gypsum and detritus, making the laminated aragonite and detritus deposits. And then flying out of the canyon, you can see the Dead Sea. This is at the southwest corner of the Dead Sea in a place called Wadi Zelim. And this is a new gully that formed by drainage in the last 8 or 9 years, and that's why I'm interested in understanding it. So you're looking off there, and you see the mud delta of the Dead Sea at the southwestern corner of the Dead Sea. That's the lower basin of the Dead Sea, so that stays flooded. Now we're going to look down, and we're going to see the mud laminae and the 30 feet deep. Okay, it's cool. I'm going to freeze the movie. Down at the bottom, 30 feet down, 10 meters down, you can see all this laminae down there. Remember that beach ridges down there, and some other things are going on up above. And so it's layered. It's a layered deposit, and that fascinates me. And so that's cool mud. Okay, we can keep flying down. You can see what it looks like as you go down toward the shore of the Dead Sea. Now we're going to turn here and look back up the canyon. Okay, it's a deep canyon and extraordinary exposure. And after 8 years, I've settled on this gully to be my main research site.
Anyway, this is the gully, and here you see Steve Austin, and this is Ray Strom, and it's not so far from the Dead Sea. It's actually opened up a little over these last decade. So there's a lot of geological activity taking place near the Dead Sea because of, about the sinkholes and everything. So the whole place is being opened up. And this is the gully that he took me to. And it's an extremely interesting gully. See Steve standing here, and you see the sedimentary layers, but also there's a lot of disruption here in the sedimentary layers, and almost certainly because of its actual location, this is evidence of the Amos Earthquake. You can see that in these fairly stable sedimentary layers, occasionally you see this activity which is indicative of earthquake. And here you see Ray cutting out a block of sediment. Now the fact of the matter is, we have this block of sediment in our downstairs apartment. They came and they took back blocks of sediment, but this block was too big for them to take place. So I've been looking after it in our downstairs apartment for the last couple of years. And the piece of information that I wanted to know was what actually this earthquake might be. And Steve let me know about that yesterday. That's why I felt I could give this talk, because this is a much later earthquake. This is an earthquake in 551 AD. It's much higher than the Amos earthquake in terms of where you see the evidence. But this is a really interesting thing, because here also with the earthquake you see the fact that it's a period of drought, because when we have a period of abundance you get these very dark layers in the sediment and a vast amount of water. So anyway, based on a number of factors which include the depth of the sediment, the presence of earthquake as revealed in those sediments, and radiocarbon dating, Steve is able to create this type of graph. And here you see down at the bottom you've got the Amos earthquake, and maybe I could say the aftershock, but maybe that's stretching it a bit. Here's another one here, and actually the one that I showed you in the block of sediment is the earthquake here in 551 AD, and that can be confirmed both by its depth, the obvious disruption in the sedimentary layers, and radiocarbon dating. But I want to go to this one now, which is Herod's earthquake in 31 BC. So who do we turn to for some background information? It's obviously Josephus, because we're talking of the days of Herod here, okay? And he writes about it in the Antiquities of the Jews in Book 15, chapter 5, stanza 2. And this is what he says. This is 31 BCE. At this time, it was that the fight happened at Actium. Now, this is the battle between Mark Antony and Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus. All right, Jeremy knows a lot about this time, so I have to be sure that I don't get it wrong. It happens to be also the 7th year of the reign of Herod. We'll talk a little bit more about Herod in a moment. There was an earthquake in Judea, right? The earthquake in 31 BCE in Judea. And of course, this is what Josephus says. Maybe he didn't appreciate the significance of the Amos earthquake so much, although he wrote about it. Such a one as had not happened at any other time. He's talking of a major earthquake in 31 BCE, which can be found in the sediments exposed now near to the Dead Sea. It was so serious that about 10,000 men also perished by the fall of houses. So it was widespread. And I ask a question. Was the temple damaged? The question is, what temple are we talking about here, folks? I found this so fascinating, I have to tell you. It's been such an interesting study for me to do this. You might think, Jeff, you're so interested in so many obscure things. But this is really significant, folks. What temple are we talking about here? Is it this one? Is it Solomon's temple? Well, we know, we have some information. We've even dealt with some of that information in times past. Building began in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, all right? 967 BCE. This is how we dated the Exodus, folks. Do you remember that? In the 480th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, he began to build the temple of the Lord. But we know that that temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. Who's he? Well, it's not actually not Nebuchadnezzar, it's Nebuzaradan, who was under the doing the orders of King Nebuchadnezzar. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. It was destroyed in the year 586, and of course the people of Israel were taken into captivity, or many of them were, not everyone, but many were taken into captivity. Of course, that captivity only lasted until King Cyrus, and then it was King Cyrus who gave the Israelites who were now in Babylon and in Persia the opportunity to return to build another temple. We could call it Zerubbabel's temple. Now, interestingly, the foundations were laid around 520 BCE, and the temple was probably finished around 516 BCE, which is 70 years since its destruction. That, I think, is also significant. The 70 years of waiting for another temple. We will return to that in the next talk, folks. And of course, we read about their encouragement to build that temple in a number of prophets, and Haggai is perhaps the main one. And this is what he says in chapter 2, verse 18. From this day on, from this 24th day of the 9th month, we won't go into all those details now, give careful thought to the day when the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid. Now, I highlighted the word Lord's because I'm going to come back to that in a little bit later. So this is Zerubbabel's temple, and this was the temple that was desecrated in the 2nd century BCE by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, if you remember, and the time of the Maccabees. This was the temple that was rededicated at the time of the establishment of Hanukkah. We talked about that in times past. It was this temple. It wasn't Solomon's temple. It was the temple that was built under the leadership of Zerubbabel when they returned from captivity. The temple was desecrated. We know that because it says this in Daniel chapter 9. And on the wing of the temple, that's this temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So I go back to my question. Was the temple damaged in the earthquake of 31 BC? Well, I just returned to this point. It doesn't actually say it, but I would predict that it was possible. In the 7th year of the reign of King Herod, there was an earthquake in Judea, such as one has not happened at any other time. If that's true, and I'm not sure it is, if that's true, then almost certainly Jerusalem itself would have been greatly damaged in that earthquake. And if we're talking the fall of houses, well, maybe the temple itself, Zerubbabel's temple itself, would have been somewhat damaged. I want to show this face now. Who's this? Any answers? It's not Josephus. Correct! It's true. Yeah, well done, Lou. It's King Herod the Great. His date's really interesting when you come to consider chronology. We did a lot when we thought about Egypt, of course, but this is also somewhat problematic to us, folks. King Herod the Great, from the year 37 to 4 BC. There are differences of opinion as to the correct chronology, but this, I think, is the standard one. And of course, King Herod the Great died 4 BC, and then of course we could think, well, hang on a minute, when was Jesus born? So this is an interesting question that is, in my opinion, unresolved. The question now for us is, why is he called King Herod the Great? He was a tyrant. He was a murderer. He wasn't Jewish, but he ruled with a rod of iron, the people of Israel. He was a great builder, and I'm glad you said that, Jeremy, because that leads to my next picture. Now, this is when I'm going to mention Hannah Ben Haim again, because I've never been here, folks. I've never been here in any of the tours that I made, and since we've lived here for the last 10 or 11 years, nearly 11 years actually. Herod was the great builder, and he built his own palaces, and they're all in and around Jericho. Now, I found these amazing pictures. John Claude Galvin, right? And I really need to acknowledge him. I only found these images yesterday, as it happens, and they're such beautiful drawings. He does innumerable number of drawings of lots of different ancient places, and this was his representation of Herod's first palace, which was destroyed in the earthquake of 31 BCE. Now, this is on the south bank near Jericho, the south bank of the Wadi Kelt. Do you remember that? We talked about it. And it here probably was filled with water. It was a time of abundance. The second palace, which was built after the earthquake, probably around the year 30 BCE, was much more palatial. And here it's on the north bank of the Wadi Kelt. Here's the Wadi Kelt down here, Kelt. Amazing, amazing. He was more particular about his own pleasure than anything else, I think. There happened to be a third palace, which was an even bigger palace, and this time it's on both sides of the Wadi Kelt. Some of the ruins are probably there to be discovered today, and when Hannah has the time to take me and Carol to see it, although it's in the supposedly occupied territories because it's near Jericho, I really, really would like to go and see the remains of these palaces. Here's another fantastic picture by the same artist of the city of Jerusalem in those days. And here you see Herod's temple. Herod's temple. This was something that I was really studying the last couple of days. When did the building begin of Herod's temple? It was after some of his palaces, the first and the second, almost certainly, perhaps not the third, probably around 20 BCE. Now, the reason I'm not certain about that is because of chronology not being absolutely clear-cut, except for one thing, and it's this. In John chapter 2, verse 20, it says this: the Jews replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days." That's an interesting one, isn't it? Now, all we need to know is what was the year when Jesus was about 30 years old, because this is John's Gospel's account, and this is right at the beginning of his ministry. It's written about in John chapter 2. So And of course there's an issue here that could be discussed. The Synoptic Gospels put the cleansing of the temple in the last week before Jesus dies on the cross, but in John's Gospel it's set at the beginning. And I believe there were two cleansings of that temple area, and this means that it's 46 years before Jesus was 30 years old. But when was Jesus 30 years old? If he was born before 4 BC when King Herod died. So this is a big issue. I think Jesus was born on that chronology around 7 BC. I know it doesn't make sense. It can't be before Christ, when Jesus was actually born, but that's the complication of the chronologies that we deal with. I think Jesus was born around 7 BC according to that chronology, and King Herod died in 4 BC. So when Jesus is 30, it's the building of the temple began 46 years earlier, so we can't know for sure. But this was something that I found so interesting. And I hope you find it somewhat interesting. In order to build his temple, Herod demolished the temple of Zerubbabel. Shall I repeat it? In order to build his temple, Herod demolished the temple of Zerubbabel. The question you might ask is, how on earth do I know that? Who do I refer to? I refer to Josephus. He goes to the top of the class here. This is later, of course, than the earthquake in 31 BCE. Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 15, Chapter 11, Stanza 1. This is what he says. This was of great concern to the Jewish leadership. This is what Josephus says. Our fathers, when they were returned from Babylon, built this temple. What temple? Zerubbabel's temple, to God Almighty. Yet does it want 60 cubits of its largeness in altitude? Yet does it want? That means it's lacking something here, folks. Yet does it want 60 cubits of its largeness in altitude? For so much did that first temple, which Solomon built, exceed this temple. The temple of Zerubbabel was almost a poor copy of what Solomon originally built. It obviously was the Lord's temple. There's no question about it because it says so, but it wasn't very magnificent. For it was not their fault that the temple was no higher. They, the Jewish leadership, because they knew what Herod wanted to do, they were afraid that he, Herod, would pull down the whole edifice and not be able to bring his intentions to perfection for its rebuilding. Herod told them, the Jewish leadership, he would not pull down their temple till all things were gotten ready for building it up entirely again. This is Josephus. And this is what Herod did. So Herod took away the old foundations and laid others. So he removed the first temple, removed its foundations, the old foundations, and laid others and erected the temple upon them. This is his temple, Herod's temple, being in length, it was much more magnificent, being in length 100 cubits and in height 20 additional cubits. I found this so fascinating. Do you know, folks, I have to set myself a study. I've got this book. I've had it on my bookshelf for a long time. You might think I'm a heretic, but I'm going to read it, all of it, because, there's so much more information for us to understand. Josephus was a historian. Not everything that he said was correct, but he was a very careful historian. And this book, which is over 700 pages long, I have in my bookshelf, and I think I'm going to read it now. So what can we say here, folks? Herod's temple. This is something that was like a revelation to me. Herod's temple is the third temple on the Temple Mount. Now, isn't that interesting? I won't go into all of it now because it'll get me distracted if I do, but this is not a rebuilding of what was there. This is a new structure that Herod built to serve his own purposes. Did Jesus have great feelings about it? This is what he says in Matthew chapter 23. Look, disciples, look, Jerusalem, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. I'm looking forward to that day when it happens. We all should be looking forward to it because that's at the return of Jesus. And of course the disciples are so taken with the beauty of this place, Herod's architecture, that they ask him questions on the Mount of Olives. And that's how Jesus replies. As for what you see here, looking at the temple buildings, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. Now, the question that I ask now, I believe, is when did the destruction begin? Any ideas on that? I think, AD 70 is significant, but also we have to take note what took place in the 2nd century AD, which we won't get into now, but I think the destruction began here. This is a picture of the tearing of the temple curtain from top to bottom. Remember Uzziah? The earthquake in the days of Uzziah, and the fact that the temple was partially damaged. This is what it says. In the meantime, about the Uzziah earthquake, a great earthquake shook the ground, and a rent was made in the temple. And the bright rays of the sun shone through it and fell upon the king's face, insomuch as the leprosy seized upon him immediately. A rent was made in the temple because of the earthquake. So what earthquake are we talking about now when we think of the temple curtain being torn from top to bottom? This is a fantastic picture that I found yesterday, which is looking at the same sedimentary layers, and here you see, it's called Actium 31 BC, the disruption of the sediments at the time of the earthquake in the days of King Herod. And here we see evidence of another earthquake, which in this particular study is called the Christ Quake. Now, it's not Steve Austin this time, it's this DVD. And I've got a clip.
When I first started looking, I thought, there's not going to be any way you can tell anything about a quake that happened 2,000 years ago, because the evidence has kind of been walked on. And then I heard about the phenomenon of the Dead Sea. Really, it's the history of Rome. It's almost the history of Western government.
As Christ is expiring on the cross, there is a great earthquake. It's big enough that it split the temple veil from top to bottom, and it broke rocks. God thought it was worth shaking the earth from these people's feet at the end of Christ's work. He's telling us something big. I think he set it up so we could discover that these things happened 2,000 years later.
As a physician with Rick, I'm often concerned about where we're going to go and what we're going to be doing. I know we're going to the Dead Sea. We're going to be climbing around in canyons, and basically he can't feel his legs and his feet.
When I first started studying the Dead Sea, I mean, these rivers, these wadis were nothing like this. They were much narrower.
The evidence is disappearing. Even though it is rock, it's disappearing.
Take a look here. That's a sinkhole. The sea withdrew and down it goes.
I think what we're looking for is probably about 2.5 meters above this layer. Problem is I can't reach it.
There's a seismite right here that's my big suspect.
Yeah. No, 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 no.
Is it possible that I could somehow see the evidence today, touch the evidence today? Is there a story in rock? Would it be possible to touch the rocks of history and hear, this is the Christ?
Just to let you know that I have ordered that DVD, so when we have another talk, the next talk, then I'll show some relevant clips, and I'll also want Steve Austin's input about the validity of some of the things that they say there, because I want to get it exactly right, to point out where the Herod's earthquake of 31 BCE is found in the rocks, and also the earthquake at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, because it says this: at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. An earthquake, folks. And of course, there was an aftershock. This is in Matthew 28 as well. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and was going to the tomb and rolled back the stone. And so we have a major earthquake at the time that Jesus died, which contributed to the tearing of the curtain from top to bottom, a rent in the temple, and of course the aftershock led to the stone being rolled away. And we're going to look more about those things next time. So that's the talk, folks.